The year 1881 bled across the plains in shades of rust and ochre. In the town of Bitter Creek, the wind was a mean thing, a bully that never tired. It swept down from the high lonesome, carrying the grit of 1,000 unpaved miles, and hurled it against the town's sun-bleached bones. It was a wind that scoured paint from wood and hope from hearts. It found every loose shutter and made it clap like a skeletal hand, every hanging sign and made it groan a complaint against its rusty chains. The sign for the Silver Spur Saloon swung on a single hinge, screaming a high, thin note that set a man's teeth on edge. Dust, red as a fresh wound, coated everything. It settled in the wrinkles around a man's eyes, seasoned the water in the horse troughs, and lay in a fine film over the dark wood of the saloon bar. Into this abrasive world rode Sawyer Hale. He sat atop his roan, Old Patch, not with the easy grace of a young buck, but with the settled weariness of a man who knew the weight of a saddle better than the comfort of a bed. He was the solitary proprietor of the Hollow Draw Ranch, a spread of land that was long on acreage but short on luck. His face was a map of his life, carved by sun and worry. A deep line was etched between his brows, a permanent fixture of concentration and concern. His eyes, the color of a stormy sky, scanned the meager length of Bitter Creek's main street, taking in the familiar landscape of defeat. His coat was the most honest thing about him, made of heavy, oiled leather. It was cracked and scarred in a dozen places. The color had faded from a rich brown to the dull, anonymous shade of the earth itself. It carried his scent, a thing as particular to him as his own shadow. It was the smell of wood smoke from 100 lonely campfires, the ghost of countless rainstorms that had soaked him to the bone, and the faint, ever-present perfume of horse and leather. It was the smell of solitude. He swung a leg over his saddle and dropped to the ground, his boots landing with a soft thud in the thick dust. The leather of his chaps creaked a protest. He tied Old Patch to the hitching post outside the general store, giving the horse's neck a familiar, rough pat. The animal snorted, shaking its head as if to dislodge the oppressive silence that clung to its master. Through the bat-wing doors of the Silver Spur, voices spilled out, thick with cheap whiskey and speculation. Sawyer didn't need to go inside to know what they were saying. News, especially bad news, traveled faster than a prairie fire in this town. Hale's losing his herd, a gravelly voice. Probably old man Hemlock the prospector would be saying, "Another dozen had vanished last week, just gone." "It's the rustlers," another, younger voice would insist. "Or maybe wolves." "Ain't no wolf that can snip barbed wire clean as a whistle," Hemlock would counter, his voice dropping. "And it ain't just the cattle. Heard Barrett Sloan's called in his note? The bank wants its money." A hush would fall over the bar then. Barrett Sloan's name had that effect. It was a name that tasted of foreclosure and cold, hard numbers. Mentioning it was like bringing a hawk into a chicken coop. The men would stare into their glasses. The easy talk soured. Sawyer's trouble was a private storm, but every man in that room knew how quickly such a storm could spread, as if summoned by the thought. The clatter of harnesses and the thunder of hooves announced the arrival of the afternoon stagecoach. It was a lumbering beast of wood and iron, caked in the dust of a long journey, pulled by 4 weary horses. The driver, a stout man named Gus with a mustache that hid his mouth, hauled back on the reins with a guttural cry of, "Whoa! Now, easy." The coach groaned to a halt in front of the post office, sending up a fresh cloud of red dust that momentarily obscured the world. Doors opened. A few passengers disembarked, stiff and grim-faced, eager to escape the confinement. And then a final figure appeared in the doorway. Her name was Eloise Hart. She paused for a moment on the coach's step, a silhouette against the harsh afternoon light. She was not a woman of delicate parlor-room beauty. There was a sturdiness to her, a sense of purpose in the set of her shoulders. Her traveling dress, a practical dark blue, was powdered with the same dust that covered everything else, but it was well made. the stitches neat and strong. She held a bonnet in one hand, her other gripping the handle of a large, heavy-looking wooden trunk that the driver was now wrestling from the coach's roof. She stepped down, her boots sinking into the dust. She didn't cough or wave a hand in front of her face. Instead, she did something peculiar. She lifted her chin, closed her eyes for a brief second, and took a deep, deliberate breath, as if sampling the very air of Bitter Creek. She smelled the dust, sharp and mineral-rich in her nostrils. She smelled the dry, baked scent of the wooden storefronts and the pungent aroma of the horses. And underneath it all, another scent, carried on the wind from the man standing by the hitching post. It was smoke and old rain and worn leather. It was the scent of a long, hard road. Her eyes opened and found him. Sawyer was watching her, his expression unreadable. A slow smile touched Eloise's lips, a small, private thing that seemed to acknowledge the raw, untamed essence of this place. She gave her head a slight, amused tilt. "You smell like trouble," she said, her voice clear and steady, carrying easily in the still air. It wasn't an accusation. It was a simple statement of fact, delivered with a teasing warmth that took the sting out of the words. Sawyer froze. For a full, suspended half-second, he stared at her, his mind struggling to process the remark. No one spoke to him that way. The people of Bitter Creek spoke to him with pity, or suspicion, or the careful distance one affords a man marked by misfortune. But this woman, a stranger with dust on her cheeks, spoke to him with an unnerving, direct whimsy. Confusion warred with a flicker of something else annoyance, perhaps, or even a ghost of amusement. The moment passed. He gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. It was not an agreement, nor a denial. It was the quiet, weary acknowledgement of a man accepting a verdict he had long ago passed on himself. A light sentence, perhaps, for a lifetime of hardship. The spell was broken by the heavy tread of Marshal Pike. The lawman was built like a barrel, his face perpetually flushed from the heat and the burden of his office. He stopped on the boardwalk, his gaze sweeping over the street. "Folks, best be securing your property tonight," he announced, his voice a low rumble. "Had another report. Someone cut a fresh stretch of barbed wire out on the Miller place. Took the whole spool." He looked from Sawyer to the new arrival, his eyes lingering for a moment before he moved on, repeating his warning to the men emerging from the saloon. Sawyer turned away from the woman. The brief, strange connection severed. He untied old Patch's reins, his movements slow and deliberate, the weight of his debt, of his dwindling herd, of the whispers in the saloon, seemed to settle back onto his shoulders, heavier than before. He began to lead his horse down the street toward the blacksmith's shop, his stride burdened, each step an effort. Eloise watched him go. The stagecoach driver, Gus, grunted as he finally heaved her wooden trunk onto the dusty ground. "Here you are. Miss, that'll be 2 bits for the extra baggage." She paid him without taking her eyes off the retreating figure in the worn leather coat. She could still smell it, that curious mixture of smoke and rain. Trouble. Yes, that was the word for it, but it was a different kind of trouble than the hushed, fearful warnings of the marshal. It was a deeper, more personal kind of trouble, the kind that made you curious, the kind that pulled you in. With a sigh, she grasped the rope handle of her trunk and began to drag it along the boardwalk, its corners bumping and scraping against the uneven planks. Her journey had been long, but she had a feeling it had only just begun. From the shaded porch of the post office, another man watched the scene unfold. Barrett Sloane stood with his arms crossed, a figure of immaculate, predatory stillness. His suit was dark and perfectly pressed, a stark contrast to the dust and disarray of the town. He was a man who profited from disarray. His face was lean, his features sharp and precise, and his lips were a thin, bloodless line. He watched Sawyer Hale lead his horse away, a man walking toward his own ruin. Then his gaze shifted, cool and assessing, to the woman dragging her life behind her in a wooden box. He watched them both, and a flicker of something that might have been interest or calculation tightened the corners of his knife-thin mouth. The wind blew, kicking up the red dust. But on the post office porch, Barrett Sloane remained untouched. Two separate lives began to trace parallel lines in the dust of Bitter Creek. One life unfolded in a small, stuffy attic room behind Mrs. Gable's dressmaking shop. The other was measured in acres of dry grass and the growing length of a banker's shadow. Eloise Hart's world was, for now, the size of that room. It smelled of old cedar and mothballs. She paid the seamstress a week's rent in advance and hauled her heavy trunk up the narrow, creaking stairs. With a grunt of effort, she pushed it into a corner and threw open the single-hinged window, letting in a slice of the dusty afternoon and the distant clang of a hammer on anvil. For a long moment, she just stood there, letting the dry air replace the stale. Then, she got to work. She opened the trunk with a decisive click of its latches. It was not filled with fine dresses or family heirlooms. It was a chest of tools, of purpose. First came the implements of her trade-heavy steel scissors that felt balanced and cool in her palm, an array of needles tucked into a felt roll, and spools of thread in a dozen practical colors. She hung the scissors from a nail already protruding from the wall. Then came the tools of her calling, a half-dozen worn copies of a McGuffey reader, their covers softened by the hands of children she'd taught in towns just like this one, towns that sat on the edge of the map, thirsty for a future. She stacked the books neatly on the small, wobbly nightstand. She arranged her world with a quiet efficiency, carving out a space for herself in the forgotten corner of a forgotten town. Miles away, yet connected by that same hammer's clang, Sawyer Hale entered the blacksmith's shop. The place was a cavern of organized chaos, smelling of coal smoke, hot iron, and horse sweat. Sparks flew from the anvil where Jedediah, the smith, was shaping a horseshoe. The heat from the forge washed over Sawyer in a physical wave, a stark contrast to the biting wind outside. He carried his saddle, slung over his shoulder. The stitching along the skirt had given way, a casualty of a hard ride and harder luck. He set it down on a workbench. "Jed," he said, his voice a low rasp. The blacksmith finished his task, plunging the glowing shoe into a barrel of water with a violent hiss. He turned, wiping sweat from his brow with the back of a leather-gloved hand. "Sawyer, let me see." Jedediah ran a thick, calloused finger along the ripped seam. "This is a bad tear. Gonna take some time." He looked up, his eyes kind but weary. "Heard you lost some more head." Sawyer offered no reply, just a slight tightening of his jaw. He watched the smith work, his gaze drawn to the glowing heart of the forge. The intense heat seemed to call to something old and painful within him. He flexed the fingers of his left hand. A web of silvery scar tissue pulled taut across his knuckles and the back of his hand. As the smith stoked the fire, sending a fresh wave of heat into the small space, the nerves beneath the old burn twitched involuntarily, a phantom pain from a fire long since extinguished. He quickly balled the hand into a fist and shoved it into his coat pocket, a gesture so practiced it was second nature. His next stop was the one he dreaded most. The Bitter Creek Bank was the town's finest building, its brick facade a proud declaration of permanence in a world of temporary wooden structures. Inside, it was quiet and cool. The air smelled of paper and polish and the cold, metallic scent of money. Barrett Sloane sat behind a large mahogany desk, writing in a ledger with a fluid, precise hand. He did not look up immediately when Sawyer entered, letting the rancher stand in the silence for a long, calculated moment. Finally, he capped his inkwell and lifted his gaze. His eyes were the color of a winter sky, and they held no warmth. "Hale," he said. It wasn't a greeting. It was an identification. "You've come about the note." "I need more time," Sawyer said. The words tasted like ash in his mouth. Sloane steepled his fingers, a faint, condescending smile playing on his thin lips. "Time is a commodity, like beef or lumber. It has a price. He slid a piece of paper across the polished desk. I can offer you an extension, 30 days. The fee, for the inconvenience and the risk, is outlined there. Sawyer picked up the paper. The number written on it was not just a fee, it was a punishment. It was a figure designed to be impossible, a weight meant to break him. He could sell half his remaining herd and still not cover it. He stared at the ink, seeing not a number but a noose tightening. "This is unreasonable," he said, his voice dangerously low. "The terms are the terms," Sloane replied, his tone unchanged. "Sign the acknowledgement of warning, or I begin foreclosure proceedings in the morning. The choice is yours." There was no choice. To fight was to lose immediately. To sign was to lose in 30 days. He chose the 30 days. He picked up the pen Sloane offered, the same pen that had signed away the futures of other men, and scratched his name on the line. He did not look at Sloane as he pushed the paper back across the desk and walked out. The silent closing of the heavy bank door, the only sound. Eloise, meanwhile, was engaged in her own form of negotiation. She found Reverend Miller tending the small, struggling garden behind the town's simple wooden church. He was a kind man, with eyes that had seen too much hardship and a spirit that refused to surrender to it. "Reverend," she began, after introducing herself, "I am a teacher. I wish to open a small school for the children of Bitter Creek." The Reverend straightened up, leaning on his hoe, a noble goal. "Miss Hart, but we have no schoolhouse." "I noticed the old grain shed behind the livery," she said, her voice full of carefully managed hope. "It's unused. The roof looks sound enough." He sighed, a long, weary sound. "The town council won't spend a penny on it. It's full of junk, the windows are broken, and the door is barely on its hinges." "Let me use it," Eloise pressed gently. "I'll clean it out myself. I'll repair it. All I ask is for permission to try." Reverend Miller studied her face, seeing not a naive newcomer but a woman with a spine made of steel. He saw the same quiet determination in her that he saw in the first spring shoots pushing through the hard-packed earth. "If you are willing to put in the labor," he said slowly, "then the Lord's work is your own. You have my blessing." That evening, as the sun began to bleed across the horizon, the men of the town gathered in the Silver Spur saloon. The talk, fueled by beer and boredom, inevitably turned to Sawyer Hale. "It's the family. One man, a freight driver named Cobb, declared, always been bad luck. The Hales, his father lost his farm to blight. His uncle drowned in a flash flood. And his brother," another man began, lowering his voice conspiratorially. "The fire." A silence fell. The fire was old news, but it was a story that still held a dark power. Cobb leaned forward, his voice dropping to a gravelly whisper. "They say anyone who gets too close to a Hale ends up paying a price. The land, the name, it's cursed." From a small table in the corner, where she was taking a simple supper of bread and stew, Eloise listened. She had heard whispers like these before. In other towns, the poison of gossip, how it could rot a man's reputation from the inside out. She set her spoon down with a quiet clink. "That's not bad luck," she said, her voice cutting through the murmurs. Every eye in the saloon turned to her. "Bad luck is a storm you can't predict, or a sickness you can't cure." She looked directly at Cobb. "The only curse I see is the greed of the man writing the figures in the bank ledger, not the one trying to make a living tending cattle in the dust." The saloon was silent for a beat, the men stunned by her directness. Then, Cobb grunted and turned back to his beer, the conversation broken. Eloise had not made friends, but she had made a point. A few days later, she was trying to wrestle a large, heavy blackboard, salvaged from the grain shed's pile of refuse. From the livery to the shed, it was awkward and heavy, and she was making slow progress, her arms aching. A shadow fell over her. "Need a hand?" It was Sawyer Hale. He had come to town for supplies, his wagon loaded with empty barrels. He stood there, his hands in his pockets, his expression unreadable as ever. "I think I might," she admitted, breathless. He didn't say another word. He simply walked to the other end of the blackboard, gripped it with his good hand, and lifted. Together, they carried it, their steps falling into an easy rhythm. Eloise was acutely aware of his proximity. The wind carried his scent to her again, but this time it was different. Underneath the familiar smoke and leather was the warm, earthy smell of his sweat, the clean scent of hay from his wagon. The trouble she had first smelled had softened, changed by the simple decency of the act. It was no longer alarming. It felt solid, grounded, warm. They set the blackboard down inside the shed. Sunlight streamed through the gaps in the boards, illuminating dancing dust motes. "Thank you," she said, meeting his stormy eyes. He just nodded, that same small, economical gesture from their first meeting. He turned and left without another word, leaving her alone in the quiet shed, the ghost of his warmth still hanging in the air. The encounter lingered in Sawyer's mind on the long ride back to Hollow Draw. It was a strange, unsettling feeling. Kindness was a currency he hadn't traded in for a long time. As his wagon rattled along the northern edge of his property, something caught his eye, a glint of newness against the old, weathered wood of a fence post. He pulled the wagon to a halt and walked over. The top strand of his barbed wire fence had been cut. It was a clean snip, not a break. His eyes scanned the ground. In the soft earth, he saw them clearly hoof prints, not from his own cattle or his horse. These were from a shod horse, and it was a heavy animal. Judging by the depth of the impressions, they led away from the fence, heading east, toward the abandoned stone quarry that bordered his land. A cold knot formed in his stomach. This wasn't rustlers taking a single steer. This was something else, something calculated. That night, a single lamp burned in Bitter Creek. It sat on a crate inside the old grain shed, casting a pool of golden light. Eloise's heart stood before the blackboard they had carried, a piece of white chalk in her hand. The shed was quiet, filled with the smells of old grain and new beginnings. She thought of the task ahead of the broken windows and the dusty floors. She thought of the whispers in the saloon and the weary sadness in the Reverend's eyes. She thought of a man with a scarred hand and the scent of warm, honest trouble. Her hand trembled slightly as she lifted it to the smooth, dark slate. With careful, deliberate strokes, she wrote a single word: hope. The night pressed down on Hollow Draw, vast and starless. It was a smothering kind of darkness that swallowed sound, leaving only the whisper of the wind through dry grass and the frantic drumming of a man's own heart inside his small, sparsely furnished ranch house. Sawyer Hale sat at his kitchen table, staring at the cold embers in the hearth. But in his mind, the fire still raged. It always came back at night. The memory wasn't a gentle thing. It was an ambush. It started not with a sight, but with a smell, the sharp, acrid scent of burning pine and horsehair. Then came the sound, a terrible, hungry roar that consumed the world. The barn fire, 10 years gone, but it might as well have been last night. He saw the flames, orange and yellow tongues licking at the dark sky, turning the familiar lines of the barn into a skeletal monster. He felt the heat on his face, a blistering wave that peeled the skin from his knuckles as he fought with the jammed door. And he heard the screams, the terrified screams of the horses, and another sound, smaller, higher pitched, that had been ripped from his younger brother's throat: Caleb. Sawyer had been 18, Caleb only 14. They had been working late, mending harnesses by lantern light. Sawyer had gone to the house to fetch a dipper of water, a gust of wind, a tipped lantern. That's all it had taken. By the time he got back, the whole front of the barn was an inferno. Should have checked the lantern hook. The voice was always there, a venomous whisper in the back of his mind. Should have made him come with you. He remembered trying to get inside, his father and a handful of ranch hands holding him back. He remembered the sickening crack and groan as the main beam gave way. a shower of sparks rising into the night like a swarm of angry fireflies. And then, silence. A silence more terrible than all the screaming that had come before. They found Caleb in the morning, under the charred timber. He was still clutching a piece of harness leather, as if he'd been trying to finish the job even as the world ended around him. The scar on Sawyer's left hand pulsed with a dull, familiar ache, a physical reminder of his failure. He had failed to save his brother. He had failed to save the barn. In the years that followed, he had failed to save his parents from the grief that hollowed them out and sent them to early graves. He was the last Hale, the sole heir to a legacy of ash and whispers. Should have gone in first. Should have held the roof up with your bare hands. The voice never tired. It was the warden of his self-imposed prison, and the bars were made of guilt. He pushed away from the table, the scrape of the chair legs loud in the oppressive quiet. He walked to the porch, needing air, needing to escape the ghosts that lived inside his house. Across the dark expanse of the prairie, a single, tiny light flickered, a pinprick of defiance against the overwhelming black. It was the lamp in the old grain shed, the teacher's light. He stood there, his hand gripping the torn lapel of his leather coat, and watched it burn. A window in a place he didn't know, holding a life he couldn't imagine. A small, square promise that the darkness wasn't absolute. In that small, square room, Eloise's heart held a needle up to the lamplight, trying to thread it. Her fingers were nimble and sure, but the thread refused to cooperate. It frayed at the end, a tiny, stubborn rebellion. The sight of the broken fibers sent a jolt through her, a memory as sharp and unwelcome as Sawyer's. She was not in a dusty shed, but in the sun-drenched sacristy of a whitewashed church in a town called Santa Vespera. It was supposed to be her wedding day. The room smelled of beeswax and lilies. Her fiancé, a handsome merchant named Alistair, was waiting, but she was staring at the church's accounting ledger, which she had stumbled upon by accident. It was all there in neat, spidery script. Father Michael, a man with a beatific smile and the coldest eyes she had ever seen, had been siphoning off the town's donations for the new orphanage. The funds, collected from poor farmers and hopeful families, were being funneled into a land acquisition scheme in his own name. The broken promises were right there, in black and white, a column of faith next to a column of fraud. She remembered the feeling, a cold sickness rising in her stomach. She had shown it to Alistair. He had paled, his eyes darting from the ledger to her face. "Eloise," he had whispered, his voice pleading, "Put it back. Don't say anything. The father is a powerful man. He could ruin us." Us. The word had struck her like a slap. There was no us. There was only his fear and her truth. In that moment, the future she had imagined a home, children, a life of quiet comfort had frayed and snapped, just like the thread in her hand. She had left the sacristy, walked straight to the town square during the midday market, and told everyone what she had found. She had not shouted. She had spoken with a clear, steady voice, the truth a solid weight in her mouth. She had been called a liar, a hysteric, a woman scorned. Alistair had publicly denied her claims. She had packed her trunk that same afternoon and boarded the first stagecoach heading north, the jeers of the townspeople following her out of town. She hadn't been running away from a fight. She had been running toward a life where she could live with herself. But the memory of that betrayal, of choosing truth over comfort, left its own kind of scar. It was a wound of disillusionment, a constant reminder that even the most sacred trusts could be broken. The wind rattled the loose pane of glass in her window. Outside, a lone coyote howled, a sound of pure, desolate loneliness that seemed to echo the ache in her own heart. She finally threaded the needle and took a stitch in a boy's torn shirt she was mending for free. The small, repetitive motion was a comfort. She looked out her own window, into the same impenetrable darkness that Sawyer was facing. She couldn't see his house, couldn't know he was there, but she felt the vast emptiness of the land around her. In another part of that same darkness, In the back room of a warehouse that smelled of grain dust and rat poison, Barrett Sloane was not alone. He sat on a crate, the lantern light carving sharp shadows on his face. Across from him stood Marshall Pike and two hard-faced men Sloane kept on his private payroll. "The wire is cut on the north pasture," Sloane said, his voice a low, calm murmur that was more intimidating than a shout. "Tomorrow. You two?" He nodded at his hired men. "Cut the southern line. I want his herd to have a clear path to the dry wash. When they get thirsty enough, they'll wander right into it. No grass, no water. They'll lose condition fast. And when they're weak and thin," he continued, his eyes glittering, "Hale will be forced to sell them for pennies on the dollar to cover his extension fee. I'll be waiting with a generous offer." Marshall Pike shifted his weight, his gaze fixed on a crack in the floorboards. "Barrett, this is going too far. Snipping wire is one thing, but driving a man's herd to ruin." Sloane's eyes snapped to the marshal. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. "Are you forgetting the personal loan I extended to you last spring? Marshall, the one that paid for your wife's treatment in Denver. The bank is a patient institution, but its patience has limits. Your debt, like Hale's, is a matter of record." Pike's face flushed a dark red. The unspoken threat hung in the air, thick and suffocating. He was trapped. His duty as a lawman was chained to his personal debt as a man. He gave a stiff, miserable nod. "I'll keep my patrols on the far side of town." "Excellent," Sloane said, the thin smile returning to his lips. He dismissed his hired men with a flick of his fingers. He and Pike were alone. "You see, Marshal, it's just business. Supply and demand. Hale has land I want. I'm simply creating a demand for him to supply it." The wind changed then. It shifted from the north to the west, carrying with it a new scent, a damp, earthy smell that promised rain. Out on his porch, Sawyer felt it, smelled it on the air. A flicker of hope. If the rain came, if it reached his pastures, it could buy him a few more days, a little more time. In her shed, Eloise paused in her mending and lifted her head, sniffing the air that drifted through her open window. Rain. She thought of the man with the sad eyes and the strong hands. She found herself whispering a small prayer into the darkness, a simple, earnest plea. Let it rain on his land, let his grass grow. Sawyer turned from the porch and walked toward his own barn, the new one, built with his own two hands on the ashes of the old. The smell of rain made him uneasy, made him think of his herd scattered across the open range. He checked the latch on the big sliding door, making sure it was secure. He walked the perimeter, his boots sinking into the soft dirt. By the time he was finished, a fine sheen of sweat coated his back, chilling him as the wind picked up. He stood for a moment, his hand on the rough wood of the barn wall, a solitary figure bracing against the coming storm. He did not know that his fences were already cut. He did not know that a plan was in motion to ruin him. And he did not know that a stranger in a dusty shed, a woman who smelled trouble and stitched hope, was praying for him. He was a man who had long ago decided to trust no one, least of all himself. He was about to find that he had no choice but to trust a stranger. The rain did not arrive gently. It came with the sudden violence of a thrown punch, a dark sheet of water that slammed into the parched earth of Bitter Creek. The sky, which had been a hazy, bruised purple moments before, opened up completely. The wind that had carried the promise of rain now drove it in near horizontal sheets, turning the main street into a churning river of red mud. Eloise's heart was caught in the middle of it, halfway between her attic room and the newly cleaned-out grain shed. She had been carrying a small, three-legged stool, a piece of furniture so humble it was almost beautiful. The first fat, cold drops of rain had struck her face like thrown pebbles. Now, she was completely soaked, her dark blue dress turning the color of a midnight sky, clinging to her skin. The stool was useless as a shield. She abandoned it and ran, not toward her room, but toward the nearest solid-looking structure, the church. She made it to the covered porch just as the deluge intensified, the roar of the rain on the wooden roof deafening. She stood there, gasping for breath, wringing water from the hem of her skirt. And then she realized she was not alone. Sawyer Hale was already there, pressed back against the church wall, as if seeking refuge not just from the rain, but from the world itself. He had been on his way out of town, but the storm had turned him back. His horse, Old Patch, stood miserably at the hitching post, head bowed against the downpour. Sawyer was watching the street, his face grim, when he heard her footsteps and turned. He saw her, drenched and shivering slightly, her hair plastered to her temples. Her dress was blotched with dark patches of water, the indigo dye bleeding into a deeper shade of blue. For a moment, they just looked at each other, two solitary figures marooned together on a small island of dry planks while the world dissolved around them. The only sound was the drumming of the rain and the gurgle of water pouring from the eaves. Eloise pushed a stray strand of wet hair from her face and offered a small, crooked smile. She tipped her head, just as she had on the day she arrived, and took a slow breath. The air was thick with the scent of rain on dried dust, of wet wood, and of him. The familiar aroma of smoke and leather was different now, deepened by the damp, mingling with the clean smell of the storm. "You still smell like trouble," she said, her voice soft, almost lost in the noise of the rain. She took a step closer, into the space he seemed to carry around him like a coat. "But it's the kind of trouble that calls a person home." The words hung in the air between them, simple and profound. It was not a flirtation. It was a recognition, an acknowledgement of the weary strength, the deep-rooted loneliness, and the stubborn resilience she had sensed in him from the very first moment. Something shifted in Sawyer's face. The hard lines around his eyes and mouth seemed to soften. The permanent tension in his shoulders eased. And then, he did something so unexpected it was almost as shocking as the storm itself. He laughed. It was not a loud sound. It was a low, rough chuckle that seemed to be dragged up from a place deep inside him, a place that had not been touched by light or warmth in a very long time. It was a rusty, unused sound, but it was genuine. The sound died, but the ghost of it remained in his eyes. He looked at her, truly looked at her, and saw not just a drenched woman, but the person who had spoken a truth he hadn't known about himself. Without a word, he shrugged out of his heavy leather coat. The movement was fluid, practiced. He held it out to her. "You'll catch a chill," he said, his voice a low rumble. She hesitated for only a second before taking it. The leather was cool and damp on the outside, but the inside, the worn flannel lining, still held the warmth of his body. She wrapped it around her shoulders. It was far too big, the sleeves hanging down past her hands, the hem nearly reaching her knees. But it was solid, heavy, a shield. She was immediately enveloped in his scent, that complex perfume of smoke and rain, now made intimate and close. It was a strangely comforting embrace. As she pulled the collar tighter around her neck, a brilliant, blinding fork of lightning split the sky, followed an instant later by a crack of thunder so loud and close it seemed to shake the very foundations of the church. The world went white, then plunged back into gray. Eloise flinched violently, a small, involuntary cry escaping her lips. She instinctively took a step back, pressing herself against the church's heavy wooden door. Sawyer saw the raw fear in her eyes. It was not the storm she was afraid of, he realized, but the sudden, violent sound. It was the shock of it, the way it ripped through the world without warning. In that moment, he acted without thinking. His own ghosts, his own fears of sudden, violent destruction, reached out to hers. He reached for the iron latch on the door. It was unlocked. With a hard shove, he pushed it open, revealing a small, dark antechamber. "In here," he said, his voice firm. He didn't wait for her to agree. He took her by the elbow, his grip surprisingly gentle, and guided her over the threshold, out of the storm's direct fury. He pulled the heavy door shut behind them, and the roar of the rain was instantly muffled. reduced to a distant, rhythmic drumming. They were in a small, seldom-used room. It smelled of old paper, lemon oil, and dust. A few simple wooden benches lined the walls, and a lectern stood in the corner. It was the church's reading room, where Reverend Miller held Bible study for the few who attended. The only light came from a single tall, arched window, its glass streaked with rain, casting the room in a dim, watery gray light. Their shadows, thrown by this faint light, were huge and distorted. Stretching up the plain wooden walls, they looked like two giants, their forms merged and indistinct. They stood close, too close, in the confined space. The air was thick with their shared breath and the unspoken tension of the moment. Sawyer looked down at her. He could see the rapid pulse in the hollow of her throat. His coat, his armor, was wrapped around her. He had shielded her from the cold, pulled her from the storm. But now, in the charged quiet of this small room, the coat felt like a barrier between them. Slowly, deliberately, he reached out, not to her, but to the collar of the coat she wore. His fingers brushed the side of her neck, a touch as light as a moth's wing, sending a tremor through her. He took hold of the heavy leather, and then he drew it from her shoulders. He let it slip from his grasp. It fell to the floor, landing on the damp, dusty wooden planks with a soft, heavy sigh. Thump. The sound was final. A surrender, a laying down of arms. The space between them was electric. The silence was absolute, broken only by the gentle patter of the rain against the window pane. He did not step forward. She did not step back. They were held in place by the gravity of the moment. Her eyes were locked on his, and in their stormy depths, she saw not trouble, but a profound and aching vulnerability. His gaze traced the lines of her face, the curve of her lips, as if he were seeing a woman for the first time in a decade. His breath was shallow, hers caught in her throat. Every word they had not said, every hardship they had ever endured, every lonely night and weary dawn, was present in that small room, in that weighted silence. Instinctively, Eloise raised a hand. She laid it flat against his chest, against the rough fabric of his shirt. The gesture was not bold, but questioning, seeking, beneath her palm. She felt the frantic, unsteady beat of his heart. It skipped once, a powerful, clumsy stumble, before finding its rhythm again. A rapid, heavy drumming that matched the rain outside. It was the most honest thing he had ever said to her. The raw, unguarded intimacy of the moment was too much. It was a beautiful, terrifying precipice, and they both knew they were not ready to step over the edge. As if by a silent, mutual agreement, they each took a half step back. It was a small movement, but it was enough to break the spell, to re-establish the fragile boundaries between them, a retreat to safer ground. At that exact moment, a strong gust of wind howled around the corner of the church. Catching the rope of the steeple bell, the bell gave a single, mournful, metallic clang. Bong! The sound was startling in the quiet room, a solemn interruption from the outside world. The tension shattered. A nervous, incredulous laugh escaped Eloise's lips. Sawyer's mouth curved into a shadow of a smile, the relief in his eyes palpable. They were just two people, taking shelter from a storm, in a church that had just spoken to them. The absurdity, the intensity, the sheer strangeness of it all was suddenly too much to bear in silence. The rain was already softening, its frantic drumming easing into a steady, gentle rhythm. The worst of the storm had passed. Outside, hidden in the deep shadows of the livery stable across the street, a man pulled his hat down lower to shield his face from the dripping eaves. He was one of Sloane's men. He had been tasked with watching Sawyer hail. He had seen the rancher and the new schoolteacher run onto the church porch. He had seen the door open and close. He was a patient man. He leaned against the rough wood of the livery, listening to the rain, and began to count the slow, steady drips of water falling from the roof. marking time until the church door opened again. The morning after the storm was deceptively clean. The rain had washed the dust from the air, leaving the sky a pale, fragile blue. Every surface in Bitter Creek, every wooden plank and rusty nail glistened with a temporary brilliance. But the cleansing was only surface deep. The mud was a different story. It was a thick, clinging morass of red clay, and it was everywhere. Eloise's heart saw it first on the windowsill of her school shed, as she pushed open the shutters to let in the fresh, cool air. Her gaze fell upon a distinct, caked handprint. It was a man's print, large and smeared, made of a peculiar, dark red mud. Below it, on the floorboards just inside the window, was a matching set of muddy boot prints. Someone had been here during the storm, had climbed in through the window, and then left the same way. A knot of unease tightened in her stomach. She scanned the small room. Nothing seemed to be missing. The blackboard was untouched. The few rickety benches were in their places, and her small stack of readers sat on the crate where she'd left them. It wasn't a robbery. It was something else. A violation. A quiet, muddy intrusion. She knelt down to examine the boot prints more closely. As she did, her fingers brushed against something small and metallic wedged in a crack between the floorboards. She worked it free. It was a tiny piece of metal, no bigger than her thumbnail, with two sharp, clean-cut ends. A snippet of barbed wire. She held it in the palm of her hand, the metal cool against her skin. It hadn't been broken or rusted through. It had been snipped, as cleanly as if by a pair of tailor's shears. Then her eyes went back to the mud. It wasn't the same color as the mud in the street. This was a deeper, richer red, almost the color of dried blood, and it was flecked with tiny, glittering fragments of stone. She had seen that color before, on her first day, in the distance. The tailings piled up at the entrance to the old, abandoned quarry east of town. She carefully wrapped the piece of wire in her handkerchief and tucked it into her apron pocket. The mud on the windowsill was already drying in the morning sun, cracking into a mosaic of silent accusation. Sawyer Hale, meanwhile, was having a conversation that was going nowhere. He stood before Marshall Pike's desk, his hat in his hands, his boots leaving damp, earthy prints on the office floor. "It's the second time." "Marshall," Sawyer said, his voice a low, controlled rumble. "The north fence last week. The south fence last night during the storm. The wire was cut clean. They're trying to drive my herd off." Marshall Pike leaned back in his chair, the wood creaking in protest. He steepled his thick fingers over his ample stomach and avoided Sawyer's gaze, choosing instead to study a fly buzzing against the window pane. Could be youngsters. Sawyer, a bit of mischief. Mischief. The word was sharp, incredulous. Driving off a man's livelihood is mischief. I followed the tracks this morning before they were washed out. Shod horse, heavy rider, headed east, toward the quarry. Pike sighed, a sound of profound weariness. He finally met Sawyer's eyes, but his own were clouded, evasive. "Look, I hear you, but what do you want me to do? I can't go arresting people based on a hoofprint and a hunch. You got no proof, no witnesses. My hands are tied." "So you're going to do nothing?" Sawyer asked, the question as flat and hard as a piece of slate. "I'm going to keep my eyes open," Pike corrected, his tone becoming defensive. "But I've got a whole town to look after. I can't spend all my time chasing shadows on your land. You want to protect your property. Sawyer, maybe you ought to spend more time riding your fences and less time complaining in my office." Sawyer stared at the marshal for a long, silent moment. He saw the flicker of shame in the man's eyes, the way he nervously adjusted his holster. He saw a man trapped, not by the law, but by something else. He put his hat back on, the gesture stiff and final. "I understand," he said, but his tone made it clear that what he understood had nothing to do with the law. He turned and walked out, leaving the marshal alone with the buzzing fly. That afternoon, Eloise began her first real lesson. She had only 3 pupils to start: the blacksmith's 2 young sons and the liveryman's daughter, but it was a beginning. The shed was clean, the blackboard was wiped down, and the sun streamed through the newly washed windows. She decided their first lesson would be geography. Not the geography of the United States or the world, but the geography of their world. She took a piece of chalk and began to sketch a map of Bitter Creek and its surroundings on the blackboard. She drew the main street, the church, the Silver Spur Saloon. She drew the creek that gave the town its name. To the west, she sketched in the rolling hills that led to Hollow Draw, marking it with a small drawing of a house. Then, she moved to the eastern side of the map. With slow, deliberate strokes, she drew the winding, rutted trail that led away from town. At the end of it, she drew a small, jagged shape. "And this," she said, tapping the shape with her chalk, "is the old stone quarry. Does anyone know what kind of stone they used to dig for there?" The children shook their heads. "It's a special kind of red granite," she explained, her voice even. "The dirt all around it is a very deep red color, much darker than the dirt in town." She looked at the children's innocent, upturned faces. "It's important to know the land around you, to know what makes one place different from another." The lesson was for the children, but the words were for herself. She was piecing together a map of her own, one made of red mud, snipped wire, and a lawman's averted eyes. Sawyer spent the rest of the day in a state of cold, quiet fury. He mended his fence, his hands working with a fierce, mechanical efficiency. With every twist of the wire, every staple hammered into wood. His resolve hardened. Pike wouldn't help him. The town wouldn't help him. The whispers in the saloon had already convicted him of being cursed. If he was going to find answers, he would have to find them himself. He would not be a victim of shadows. He would hunt them. As dusk settled, painting the sky in shades of bruised orange and purple, he made his preparations. He didn't light a lamp in his house. He cleaned and oiled his rifle by the fading light. His movements economical and precise. He packed a small canvas sack with a length of rope and a canteen of water. He was going to the quarry. He would wait, all night if he had to, and see who came to visit a place that was supposed to be abandoned. He would go alone. It was his fight, his trouble. He had always been alone. He was saddling Old Patch in the barn when a figure emerged from the twilight. It was Eloise. She was carrying a lantern, but she hadn't lit it. She walked with a purpose that made it clear this was not a casual visit. She stopped a few feet from him, her silhouette framed by the last light of day. "You're going out there tonight, aren't you?" she asked. It wasn't a question. Sawyer finished tightening the cinch on his saddle before he turned to face her. "This isn't your concern. Someone was in my school last night," she said, her voice steady. "They left red mud on the windowsill and a piece of cut barbed wire on the floor." Sawyer's head snapped up. His eyes narrowed, studying her face in the gloom. "The kind of red mud from the quarry," she continued. "The law won't help you. Willett Marshal Pike sent you away this morning." He didn't answer. He didn't need to. "You can't go alone," she said. "I can and I will," he countered, his voice hard. "This is my land, my cattle, my problem." She took a step closer, the space between them shrinking. "Trouble smells trouble." "Sawyer," she said, her voice dropping, becoming softer but more intense. "It's how we find each other. I'm not asking for your permission. Let me go with you." He stared at her, at the unwavering determination in her eyes. He saw a foolishness there, a stubbornness that could get her killed. But he also saw the same unyielding strength he'd seen that day in the saloon, the same quiet courage he'd felt when she'd put her hand on his chest in the church. He was a man accustomed to solitude, but for the first time, the thought of it felt less like a strength and more like a weakness. To refuse her would be to deny the only help he had been offered. He gave a single, sharp nod. "Stay behind me. Make no sound." They rode out not as 2 people, but as 2 shadows detaching themselves from the greater darkness. They avoided the main trail. sticking to the gullies and draws, the moonless night their only ally. When they got within a half-mile of the quarry, they dismounted, tying their horses in a thicket of cottonwood trees. They proceeded the rest of the way on foot. The quarry was a scar on the landscape, a gaping wound in the earth. As they crept closer, a sound reached them, carried on the night air. It was the rhythmic, percussive scrape of a shovel hitting rock and dirt. It was followed by a heavy, dragging sound, the sound of a full sack being pulled across uneven ground. Sawyer put a hand on Eloise's arm, signaling for her to stop. They crouched behind a large boulder, peering into the gloom. The sounds were coming from a dilapidated shack on the edge of the quarry pit, a small structure that had once served as the foreman's office. A faint line of orange light glowed from beneath its poorly fitting door. They moved with an agonizing slowness, from one shadow to the next, until they were pressed against the shack's rough, splintered wall. The wood was thin, and they could hear voices from within, low and guttural. Sawyer found a wide crack in the boards and put his eye to it. Inside, 2 men were working by the light of a single lantern. They were the same 2 men Sawyer had seen loitering outside the saloon. Men who did odd jobs for anyone who would pay them. Men with mean, empty eyes. One was shoveling something from a sack into a wooden crate. The other was cataloging items on a small, makeshift table. Sawyer's eyes swept over the contents of the table, and his blood ran cold. There was a large can of kerosene. Next to it lay a pair of heavy-duty fencing pliers, the kind that could snip through barbed wire with a single, easy squeeze. And next to the pliers was a small, leather-bound ledger book. It was open, and even from his vantage point, Sawyer could see the neat columns of figures. The man at the table dipped a pen in an inkwell and made a new entry. Then he pushed the ledger aside, revealing an embossed symbol on the cover, a stylized, intertwined with a set of balancing scales, the mark of the Sloan National Bank. A horse whinnied nearby, dangerously close. The men inside the shack froze. What was that, one of them whispered? Sawyer's heart hammered against his ribs. He grabbed Eloise's arm, his grip like iron, and pulled her away from the wall. He shoved her behind a massive wooden bin filled with fine, white rock dust, a byproduct of the quarry's operations. He squeezed in behind her just as the shack door creaked open. A sliver of lantern light cut through the darkness. "Probably just a coyote," one of the men grumbled. Peering out into the night, he stood there for a long moment, then spat on the ground and went back inside, slamming the door shut. Sawyer and Eloise remained frozen in their hiding spot. The fine, powdery dust was in the air, in their lungs. It tickled the back of Eloise's throat, and she felt an overwhelming urge to cough. She pressed her face into Sawyer's back, smothering the sound. He could feel her body trembling against his. He held his own breath until his lungs burned, his mind racing, putting the pieces together with a terrible, crystalline clarity. The cut fences, the marshal's reluctance, the tools on the table, and the book, a book of accounts, signed and sealed with the mark of the man who held his future in his hands. It wasn't a curse. It wasn't bad luck. It wasn't the ghost of his brother or the sins of his father. It was a plan. A cold, calculated, meticulously documented business transaction designed to bleed him dry and steal his land. His misfortune had a name. It had a ledger. It had a signature. The silence that followed the slam of the shack door was a fragile thing. Sawyer and Eloise huddled behind the bin of rock dust, their bodies pressed together, hardly daring to breathe. The fine, alkaline powder was in Sawyer's nostrils, in the back of his throat. He could feel the desperate, suppressed urge to cough building in Eloise's body where it was pressed against his. Then came the sound that broke the world. It was Old Patch, his horse, letting out a low, impatient nicker from the cottonwood grove. Inside the shack, the scraping stopped. A chair scraped back. "That weren't no coyote," a voice growled. There was no more time for stealth, no more time for planning. There was only the raw, screaming instinct for survival. Sawyer's mind became a place of cold, clear action. He looked at Eloise, his eyes conveying a message for which there were no words. Run. He exploded from behind the bin. He didn't run for the horses. He ran for the shack. He hit the flimsy door with his shoulder, the wood splintering inward with a loud crack. The two hired men were caught in a tableau of surprise, their faces pale and stupid in the lantern light. Turning toward him, Sawyer's arm shot out, sweeping across the table. He didn't have time to be selective. His hand closed around the cold, heavy leather of the bank ledger and the greasy steel of the fencing pliers. He knocked the kerosene can over in the process. It clattered to the floor, a dark, flammable slick spreading across the boards toward the lantern. Now he roared at Eloise. She was already moving, sprinting for the cottonwood grove, her skirts gathered in her fists. The two men in the shack recovered from their shock, one letting out a bellow of rage. Sawyer was already out the door, turning to run, the ledger and pliers clutched in one hand. The chase was not a thing of grace. It was a frantic, clumsy scramble over loose rock and treacherous ground. Boots slipped on gravel, lungs burned. The shouts of the men behind them were animal sounds, full of fury and surprise. They reached the horses, fumbling with the reins with the numb, panicked fingers. Sawyer threw the ledger and pliers into his saddlebag and vaulted onto Old Patch's back, kicking the horse into a gallop before he was even properly seated. Eloise was right beside him, her face a pale oval in the darkness, her body moving with the rhythm of her horse as if she'd been born in a saddle. They burst from the cover of the trees and onto the open ground, heading not for the main trail, but for the narrow, winding cut in the landscape known as Red Knife Gulch. It was a shortcut, but a dangerous one, a gamble. A gunshot cracked the night open. A slug whined past Sawyer's ear. A hot, angry insect. He bent low over his horse's neck, urging the animal on, faster. They plunged into the mouth of the gulch. The walls rose up on either side of them, sheer cliffs of dark red rock that seemed to press in on them, to steal their air. The ground was uneven, littered with loose stones that turned under the horse's hooves. Another shot, this time. The bullet struck the rock wall beside Eloise's head, pulverizing stone into a puff of red dust. Sparks flew as a horseshoe scraped against a flint outcrop. The walls of the gulch were a red blur. The sounds of their frantic flight, the horses' desperate, snorting breaths. The clatter of hooves, the pounding of their own blood in their ears echoing around them. It was like riding down the barrel of a gun. The two men were closing the distance. Their horses were fresh, and they knew this terrain. Sawyer risked a glance over his shoulder. They were less than 50 yards behind, two dark shapes gaining with every stride. They couldn't outrun them. He saw it then, a narrow choke point in the gulch, where the walls squeezed in so tightly that only one rider could pass at a time. Stretched across it, half buried in the scree, was a length of old, rusted barbed wire, a remnant from some long-forgotten fence. It was their only chance. "Keep going," he yelled to Eloise. "Don't stop." Without slowing, he swung his leg over the saddle. For a heart-stopping moment, he ran alongside his horse, his hand gripping the pommel. Then he let go, his boots hitting the ground hard, his knees jarring from the impact. Old Patch, riderless, galloped on after Eloise. Sawyer scrambled for the rusted wire. The barbs tore at his hands as he hauled it free from the rocks. He braced his boots against the canyon wall and pulled with all his strength. Stretching the wire taut across the narrowest part of the pass, looping it around a rocky outcrop. It was a flimsy, desperate barrier, but it might be enough. He heard the lead horse of their pursuers bearing down on him. There was no time to get away. He flattened himself into a shallow depression in the rock wall as the first rider came charging through. The man saw the wire at the last second, his eyes widening in the gloom. He hauled back on the reins, his horse rearing up with a terrified squeal, its front hooves flailing in the air just inches from Sawyer's face. At that moment, a strange sound cut through the chaos. A loud thump hiss, followed by a brilliant red light that erupted from further down the gulch, painting the rock walls in a demonic, fiery glow. Eloise, she had reined in her horse, turned, and pulled a signal flare gun from her own saddlebag, a piece of emergency equipment from her school supplies. She had fired it straight into the air. The rearing horse, already panicked, shrieked in terror at the sudden, unnatural light and sound. It spun, throwing its rider hard against the canyon wall. The second rider, blinded by the flare, pulled his horse to a skidding, chaotic halt. The diversion had worked, but the first rider, though thrown, was back on his feet. He was a big, burly man, and his face was a mask of pure rage. He ignored the flare, ignored his horse. He saw only Sawyer, scrambling to his feet. With a roar, he lunged. He slammed into Sawyer, driving the air from his lungs. The two men went down in a tangle of limbs, grappling in the dirt. The man was stronger, heavier. He drove his fist into Sawyer's ribs, a dull, sickening impact. Sawyer kicked out, connecting with the man's knee. The man grunted in pain but didn't release his hold. They rolled over and over, a desperate, grunting, kicking fight in the red dust. Sawyer felt his back hit the edge of something. The ground beneath him gave way, loose rock and gravel. He looked and saw nothing but blackness. They were on the very edge of the gulch's steep drop-off. The man above him grinned, a flash of yellow teeth in the dying red light of the flare. He put his hands on Sawyer's chest and pushed. As he began to slide, as the gravel cascaded into the abyss below him, the world dissolved. The man's face vanished. The red flare light became the orange of a barn fire. The feeling of being pulled down, dragged into the darkness, was the feeling of a heavy, burning beam pressing the life out of him. The terrified screams of the horses in the gulch became the screams of the horses in his barn. He could smell the smoke. He could feel the heat. He was 18 again, and his brother was trapped inside. Caleb. The name was a silent scream in his mind. A hand, cold and spectral, was gripping the back of his coat, pulling him down into a grave of failure and ash. He was paralyzed, lost in a memory that was more real than the rock crumbling under his fingers. "Sawyer, look at me." The voice was a blade. It sliced through the smoke and the memory, sharp and clear and insistent. It was not a voice from the past. It was here, now. It was Eloise. He blinked, and the face of the henchman swam back into view. He looked past him, down the gulch. Eloise sat on her horse, her face illuminated by the last vestiges of the flare. Her eyes wide, fixed on his. They were not eyes of fear. They were anchors. They were a command. They were pulling him back from the edge of the memory, back into the world of the living. The spectral hand on his coat vanished. The smell of smoke became just the smell of a signal flare. The past retreated, leaving only the present, a man trying to kill him on the edge of a cliff. Adrenaline, cold and pure, surged through him. He stopped fighting against the man's weight and instead used it. He let his body go limp for a second, then twisted hard, using the man's own forward momentum to roll them both away from the edge. They spun, and Sawyer came out on top. He didn't have his rifle, which had been knocked from his hand. He didn't hesitate. He grabbed the heavy, walnut stock of the man's own gun, still holstered at his side. He ripped it free and, in one fluid motion, brought the butt of it down hard against the side of the man's head. There was a dull, heavy thud, and the man went limp beneath him. Sawyer lay there for a second, gasping for air, the coppery taste of blood in his mouth. The second rider, his vision returned, was fumbling to get his own gun out. "Sawyer," Eloise shouted again. She galloped her horse toward them, leading Old Patch behind her. She reached into Sawyer's saddlebag, pulled out the canvas sack containing the ledger and the pliers, and threw it to him. The proof go. He caught it, scrambled to his feet, and swung himself onto Old Patch's back. They kicked their horses into a gallop, leaving the two men, one unconscious, the other still struggling with his spooked horse behind them in the red dust. They burst out of the far end of the gulch just as the first rays of dawn broke over the horizon. The sun, finally free of the storm clouds, washed the landscape in a clean, golden light. The air was cool and smelled of wet earth and sage, and smoke. The faint, acrid smell of the spent flare still clung to Sawyer's clothes. But it was different now. It was no longer the smell of his brother's death, the smell of his failure. It was mixed with the scent of rain and Eloise's courage. It was the smell of their survival. It was the smell of a fight they had won together. It was no longer the smell of trouble. It was the smell of safety. From the crest of a high hill overlooking the trail to Bitter Creek, Barrett Sloane lowered a brass spyglass from his eye. He had watched the entire chase, a small, dark figure observing a drama of his own making. He had seen the flare, seen one of his men go down, and seen his prize, the ledger, galloping away toward town. His face, in the clear morning light, was a placid mask, but his eyes were chips of ice. He raised a hand and made a sharp, chopping motion to a third rider who had been waiting with him. It was a silent, simple command. Block the road. No one gets into town. As Sawyer and Eloise rounded the final bend, they saw him, a lone rider, sitting his horse in the middle of the road, blocking their path. His rifle was resting across his lap. They were still a quarter of a mile away, but the message was clear. They were caught between the men in the gulch and the man ahead. Trapped. They pulled their horses to a halt. Sawyer looked at the rider, then at the open prairie stretching out on either side of them. They could run, disappear into the hills, live as fugitives. The thought was a bitter poison. He looked at Eloise. Her face was smudged with dirt. Her hair was a wild tangle, but her eyes were clear and steady. She was watching him, waiting for his decision. He thought of the years of hiding, of living inside the prison of his own guilt. He thought of the whispers in the saloon, the marshal's averted eyes, the smug, cold confidence on Barrett Sloane's face. He clutched the canvas sack that held the proof. "I'm not running anymore," he said, his voice raw. "We ride straight in. We show the whole town what he's been doing." Eloise held his gaze. She thought of the lies in Santa Vespera, of a truth she had been forced to carry alone. She was not alone now. She reached out and placed her hand on his forearm, her grip firm and sure. "My word is not enough," she said, her voice quiet but ringing with conviction. "But it will be when the truth is standing right beside it." She straightened in her saddle, her chin lifted. She looked past the lone rider, toward the town of Bitter Creek, a town that had offered her nothing but dust and whispers. Together, they nudged their horses forward, from a walk to a trot, their pace steady and deliberate. They were no longer running from a fight. They were riding to start one. The town of Bitter Creek did not have a proper courthouse. Justice, when it was required, was dispensed wherever a flat surface could be found to serve as a judge's bench and enough space could be cleared for a crowd to gather. That morning, the house of God became a house of law. Judge Porter, a circuit judge whose territory was larger than some eastern states, had been in town by chance, settling a dispute over a stray mule. Now, he found himself presiding over something far more volatile. He stood behind the pulpit, the Holy Bible pushed to one side to make room for his own leather-bound book of statutes. His face was weathered and stern, his eyes accustomed to looking for the truth in a world full of lies. The church was packed, every pew was full, and people stood 3 deep along the walls and in the aisle. The entire town seemed to be present, drawn by the irresistible gravity of high drama. The air was thick and close, smelling of damp wool from the morning's lingering dew, old sawdust from the church's construction, and the sharp, collective sweat of human anxiety. Light streamed in through the tall, arched windows, illuminating the swirling dust motes in golden shafts, making the scene feel both sacred and profane. At the front, on a simple wooden table that usually held communion wine and bread, sat the evidence. The dented can of kerosene, the heavy, steel fencing pliers, and the bank ledger, its leather cover looking dark and sinister in the solemn light. Sawyer Hale and Eloise Hart stood on one side of the table. Barrett Sloane stood alone on the other. He was immaculate, his dark suit an affront to the rustic simplicity of the church. He looked perfectly at ease, a faint, condescending smile playing on his lips, as if he were observing a mildly amusing, if slightly pathetic, local custom. Marshal Pike stood near the door, his arms crossed, his face a mask of strained neutrality. He was trying to look like an impartial officer of the law, but he looked more like a man waiting for a tooth to be pulled. "Let's begin," Judge Porter's voice boomed, silencing the low murmur that had filled the room. "Mr. Hale, you've made a serious accusation. Present your case." Sawyer did not speak. He looked at Eloise. This part of the story was hers. Eloise stepped forward. Her voice, in contrast to the judge's, was not loud, but it was clear and steady, and it carried to every corner of the crowded room. She did not use dramatic language or point accusing fingers. She simply told the truth. She described finding the red mud and the snipped wire. She recounted the journey to the quarry, the sounds from the shack, and what they had seen through the crack in the wall. She spoke of the chase through Red Knife Gulch. She told the story plainly, her words like clean, smooth stones, each one landing with its own specific weight. When she finished, a heavy silence filled the church. The townspeople looked from Eloise's earnest face to the objects on the table, and then to the impassive, smiling face of Barrett Sloane. The evidence was circumstantial, but the story was compelling. Judge Porter stroked his gray beard, his eyes fixed on the banker. "Mr. Sloane, your response." Barrett Sloane chuckled, a dry, dismissive sound. He did not even glance at the items on the table. Instead, he reached into his coat pocket and produced a single, folded piece of paper. He placed it on the pulpit before the judge. It was Sawyer's loan agreement, with the signed warning for late payment attached. "Your Honor," Sloane began, his voice smooth and reasonable. "While Miss Hart's tale is certainly colorful, it is also irrelevant. The facts are these: Mr. Hale owes my bank a significant sum of money. His payment is past due. He signed an extension agreement with a punitive fee, which is also now past due. This morning, I was preparing to file for foreclosure on the Hollow Draw Ranch, as is my legal right." He gestured vaguely toward Sawyer. "This entire melodrama is nothing more than a desperate, last-ditch effort by a failed rancher to avoid his financial obligations. He has manufactured this conspiracy to slander my name and defraud his creditor. As for these items," he waved a dismissive hand at the table, "a can of oil, a common tool, and a book he likely stole from my office. It's meaningless theatrics." The crowd shifted. The word foreclosure was a cold wind that blew through the church. Every man and woman in that room understood debt. They understood the power of a signature on a piece of paper. Sloane's explanation was simple, cold, and based on the one law everyone in the West truly understood: the law of the dollar. Judge Porter picked up the loan document, his brow furrowed. "The woman claims these items were in the possession of men in your employ. Men who have done occasional odd jobs for the bank." "Yes," Sloane conceded smoothly, "which proves nothing. Perhaps Mr. Hale paid them to create this little scene for him. He is a desperate man, after all, and desperate men do desperate things." The judge looked at Marshal Pike. "Marshal, you have investigated Mr. Hale's claims of cut fences." Every eye in the room swiveled to the lawman. Pike shifted on his feet, his face flushing a deep, mottled red. He cleared his throat. "Your Honor, I looked into it, but there was no proof. No witnesses. Could have been anything." He refused to meet Sawyer's gaze. He would not meet Eloise's. Eloise's clear voice cut through the tense silence. "Marshal Pike." He flinched, but he did not look at her. "When you were sworn into your office, she continued, her tone not accusatory, but genuinely questioning. "You took an oath. Who did you swear to protect?" The question hung in the air. A stunning, simple indictment. Pike's jaw worked, but no sound came out. He was protecting his own secret, his own debt, and in that moment, everyone in the church knew that he was compromised. His silence was a confession. Judge Porter's gaze hardened. He tapped a thick finger on the bank ledger. "The contents of this book may shed some light on the matter. I am impounding these items as evidence. I am giving the bank 2 days, 48 hours to produce its primary ledgers for comparison, and to allow me to verify the source of the funds recorded in this expense book." A murmur rippled through the crowd. 2 days. It was a small victory, a stay of execution. But Barrett Sloane was not a man who accepted even small defeats. He turned his attention from the judge to the crowd, his smile gone, replaced by a look of sober, shared concern. He was no longer the defendant. He was their fellow businessman. "Friends," he said, his voice resonating with false sincerity. "Neighbors. Many of you have your life savings in my bank. Many of you have taken small loans from me to buy seed, or repair a wagon, or see you through a hard winter." He let his gaze drift over the faces of the small-time ranchers and shopkeepers. "Think about what this means," he continued, his voice dropping, "becoming conspiratorial. This man is asking the judge to simply ignore his debt, to erase the fees he legally agreed to pay. If Judge Porter allows a man to simply walk away from his obligations because he tells a sad story, what does that mean for your loans? What does that mean for the money you have entrusted to my care? If he gets his fees erased, it is your money he is stealing. Your savings will pay for his special treatment." The poison worked instantly. The mood in the church shifted, curdled. The crowd was no longer a group of spectators. They were a jury of creditors. A man who owed the mercantile $5 for nails looked at Sawyer, and his eyes were hard. A woman who had a small savings account in Sloane's bank, money set aside for her daughter's wedding, gripped her husband's arm, her face tight with fear. The whispers started, a low, ugly chorus. "Sloane's right. If Hale don't pay, who's next? My money's in that bank." Their eyes, which had held a measure of sympathy only moments before, now looked at Sawyer as if he were a thief. They saw him not as a man fighting for his home, but as a threat to their own. Their collective gaze was a physical weight, a set of invisible stocks closing around his neck. Through it all, Sawyer remained silent, his face like carved stone. He watched the fear and suspicion ripple through the faces of his neighbors, people he had known his whole life. He had expected no better. Judge Porter banged his gavel on the pulpit, but the murmuring continued. "Finally," Sawyer spoke. His voice was not loud, but it cut through the noise with the authority of absolute conviction. "I pay my debts," he said, looking not at the judge or at Sloane, but at the faces in the crowd. "I pay them with sweat, and I pay them with beef. I don't pay them with dirty fire and a pair of pliers in the dark." The simplicity of the words, the raw, unvarnished honesty in his tone, struck a different chord. The murmuring faltered. He was not asking for pity. He was stating a creed. At that moment, as if on cue, the wind picked up outside. The same wind that had brought the storm the day before. It moaned around the corners of the church and tugged at the bell rope. A single, clear, resonant chime rang out, just as it had when he and Eloise had stood in the reading room. Bong! The sound seemed to wash through the church, a moment of clean, metallic truth in the stuffy, poisoned air. Eloise looked at Sawyer. He was standing tall, unbowed by the fear and accusation of the crowd. He was still wearing the same clothes from the chase, his shirt torn, his face bruised. His old leather coat, which he had taken back from her after the storm, was slung over his shoulder. The faint, familiar scent of wood smoke seemed to reach her, even from across the room. It was no longer the smell of a past tragedy. It was the smell of surviving the gulch, the smell of a man who would stand his ground. even if he had to stand it alone. It was the smell of a promise of a peace that had to be fought for. And in that moment, she knew, with an unshakable certainty, that she would stand with him, no matter what the cost. Night fell, but sleep did not come to Bitter Creek. A nervous, watchful energy lingered in the air after the day's impromptu hearing. The 48-hour reprieve felt less like a pause and more like the tense quiet before a lightning strike. People stayed up late, talking in low voices behind closed doors. The names Lone a poison on their tongues, the name Hale a question mark. The first sign of trouble was not a sound, but a light. A sullen, predatory orange glow began to bloom against the darkness at the north end of town. It flickered and pulsed, an unnatural heartbeat in the night. Then came a shout, thin and reedy at first, then taken up by another, deeper voice. "Fire! The depot warehouse is on fire!" The cry was a spark in a tinderbox. Doors were thrown open. Men, half-dressed, poured into the muddy street. The volunteer fire bell began to clang, a frantic, chaotic rhythm that spoke of pure panic. Sawyer Hale was on his porch, where he had been all evening, staring into the darkness that had been his only companion for so long. He saw the glow and was on his feet before the first shout reached him. He didn't need to be told which building it was. The warehouse depot, the place where the bank, under the town charter, was required to store its official, long-term records, the primary ledgers the judge had demanded to see. In her small attic room, Eloise's heart was at her window. She, too, had been unable to sleep, her mind replaying the faces in the church, the fear, the greed, the doubt. She saw the light and her blood ran cold. It wasn't an accident. It was an answer. It was Barrett Sloane's answer to the judge's order. If you can't hide the evidence, burn it. They met in the middle of the street, two figures moving with a shared, desperate purpose while others ran in confusion. No words were exchanged. A single look passed between them, a flash of grim understanding. They ran, their boots sinking into the thick mud, their lungs burning from the cold night air. The warehouse was a roaring beast by the time they got there. Flames, 100 feet high, were devouring the dry timber, spewing a column of black, greasy smoke into the starless sky. The heat was a physical blow, a solid wall that pushed them back. A small, disorganized bucket brigade was already forming, but their efforts were pathetic against the inferno. The front loading doors were an impassable wall of fire. "The records!" Sawyer yelled over the roar. "He's burning the records!" He scanned the side of the building, his eyes narrowed against the searing heat. There was a small office window, dark and intact, away from the main blaze, but with smoke already seeping from its frame. It was their only chance. He grabbed a heavy, discarded iron pin from a broken wagon hitch lying in the mud. He wrapped his fist in the tail of his shirt, and with a guttural roar, he swung. The glass didn't just break. It exploded inward with a sharp bang, a shower of glittering shards vanishing into the smoke-filled darkness within. Jagged teeth of glass remained in the frame. "I'll go," Eloise said, already moving toward the nearby water barrel. Before Sawyer could protest, she had plunged her thick woolen shawl into the icy water, wringing it out until it was a heavy, dripping cloth. She wrapped it methodically around her right hand and forearm, creating a crude but effective shield. "I'm smaller. I'll fit." She didn't wait for his argument. She put her foot on the sill, and with a push from Sawyer, she wriggled through the broken window, disappearing into the choking blackness. For Sawyer, the moments that followed were an eternity. He could hear nothing but the fire's hungry throat, see nothing but the shifting, monstrous shadows it cast. He paced helplessly, his fists clenched, his mind screaming. Inside, it was a different kind of hell. The smoke was a thick, blinding fog that clawed at Eloise's eyes and throat. The heat was suffocating. She dropped to her hands and knees, where the air was clearer, and crawled forward. Her wrapped hand held out in front of her. The office was small, filled with filing cabinets and desks. She could hear the crackle and pop of the fire eating its way through the adjoining wall. She saw it then, a heavy-looking iron strongbox sitting on a thick wooden shelf. The shelf itself was already smoldering, the wood blackening and beginning to groan under the box's weight. As she reached it, the shelf gave way with a sickening crack. The strongbox tipped and fell, hitting the floor with a deafening clang. The latch, already weakened by the heat, burst open. Papers exploded outward, a blizzard of white in the swirling smoke. They were caught in the updraft, scattering like a flock of burning birds. Invoices, deeds, loan agreements. The financial soul of Bitter Creek were being consumed before her eyes. She ignored the papers that flew past her. She grabbed the two heaviest, most important-looking volumes, the thick, leather-bound primary ledgers. She clutched them to her chest, her body curled around them as if protecting a child. "Sawyer!" she screamed, her voice a raw, ragged thing. The fire had breached the office wall. A curtain of flame now separated her from the window. The main door to the office, her only other way out, was blocked by a pile of collapsed, burning debris. She was trapped. Sawyer heard her cry. He ran to the main office door from the outside and threw his shoulder against it. It was jammed shut, the wood already scorching hot. He could hear the fire raging on the other side. A primal fear, cold and absolute, seized him. He saw her face then, a pale, soot-stained image in the maelstrom, framed by the now burning doorway. She was holding the ledgers, but she couldn't get through the wall of flame. He didn't think, he acted. In one swift, violent motion, he ripped the heavy leather coat from his own shoulders. It was his armor, his shield, the repository of his past. He ran to the water barrel, plunged it in until it was soaked and heavy, and ran back. "Cover your face!" he yelled. "When I throw it, run!" He swung the coat, a heavy, dripping shield, and flung it with all his strength. It sailed through the air and landed directly over the section of fire blocking the doorway, its weight and wetness momentarily smothering the flames with a vicious hiss. Eloise didn't hesitate. She ran, her head down, the precious ledgers clutched in her arms. She burst through the gap he had created, stumbling into the muddy street, gasping the clean, cold air. Sawyer moved to follow, but a section of the roof collapsed inside, sending a fresh wave of fire and sparks surging through the doorway, cutting off his escape. It was then that Marshal Pike arrived, not as a hesitant, compromised official, but as a man possessed. The shame and fear in his eyes had been burned away by the fire, replaced by the raw, simple duty of a man pushed too far. He saw Eloise with the ledgers. He saw Sawyer trapped. He plunged into the building, a wet blanket held in front of him, and emerged a moment later, dragging a coughing, staggering Sawyer with him. Pike didn't stop. He pushed Sawyer toward Eloise and turned back to the inferno. "The double ledger!" he yelled, his voice hoarse. "He kept a second set. It has to be in there." He disappeared back into the smoke. An agonizing minute passed. Then Pike staggered out again, his uniform smoking, his face black with soot. In his hands, he held a third, smaller ledger, its cover already scorched. He fell to his knees, coughing, and threw the book into the mud at Judge Porter's feet, who had just arrived on the scene. From the edge of the chaos, a figure detached itself from the shadows and began to walk, then run, away from the firelight, toward the darkness of the open prairie. Barrett Sloan? He had been watching the destruction of his lies, his face a calm, placid mask in the flickering orange light. Now, with the appearance of the third ledger, the mask had cracked. His face was the face of a cornered rat. He didn't get 10 feet. The townspeople, who had been a disorganized, panicked mob moments before, were now a single, solid entity. They formed a silent, human wall, blocking his escape. Blacksmiths and store owners, ranchers and farmers, they said nothing. They just stood there, their faces illuminated by the fire he had set, hard with a terrible, final judgment Judge Porter knelt and opened the book Pike had rescued. Even in the chaotic light, the truth was undeniable. It was a meticulously kept record of a secret set of accounts. One column listed every late fee and extension penalty Sloan had ever charged. The adjoining column showed a corresponding deposit made on the same day into a private investment fund under his own name. It was all there. Years of extortion, written in his own neat, precise hand. The judge looked up, his face grim. "Barrett Sloan," he declared, his voice cutting through the noise. "By the authority of this territory, I am placing you under arrest for fraud, arson, and attempted murder." A sound rippled through the crowd. It wasn't a cheer. It was a strange, collective exhalation of breath, followed by a scattered burst of applause that popped and crackled like the last embers of the dying fire. Sawyer was leaning against a hitching post, his body racked with deep, ragged coughs, trying to clear the smoke from his lungs. His face was black with soot. His shirt was in tatters. Eloise was beside him, her hand on his back, steadying him. He finally caught his breath, his whole body aching. He looked at the scene at Sloan being led away in cuffs, at his neighbors starting to work together to put out the last of the flames, at the rescued ledgers lying in the mud like sacred texts. Eloise leaned in close, her voice a quiet whisper in his ear, meant only for him. "Your trouble," she said, her breath warm against his skin. "It just saved the whole town." His gaze fell upon a ruined thing lying on the wet, muddy ground. It was his coat, a wide, black, scorched patch spread across its back. The leather curled and cracked. The flannel lining burned away. It was a testament, a physical proof of a choice. The moment a man who had spent his life shielding himself had dropped his defenses to shield someone else. The dawn that followed the fire was quiet and astonishingly clear. The smoke had dissipated, leaving behind the sharp, clean scent of wet ash and pine. There was no formal trial. Justice, it turned out, was a much simpler thing when the evidence was written in the defendant's own hand. By the time the sun had fully risen, Judge Porter, working by lantern light in the church vestry, had laid the truth bare. The rescued ledgers told a damning story. Page after page detailed Barrett Sloan's systematic fraud. Every punitive fee, every exorbitant extension charge levied against the ranchers and farmers of Bitter Creek was meticulously recorded, with a corresponding entry showing the funds diverted into Sloan's personal investment accounts. It was a roadmap of greed. The judge's ruling was swift and absolute. All of Sloan's fraudulent fees were declared null and void. For Sawyer Hale, and for a dozen other families who had been struggling under the banker's thumb, it was as if a great, invisible weight had been lifted from their shoulders. Sawyer's debt to the bank was not erased. Justice was not a fantasy, but it was restructured. The terms were made fair, tied to the realistic cycles of the seasons and the price of beef, to the rhythm of the grass growing and the cattle fattening. It was a debt that could be paid with hard work, not a man's soul. Later that morning, in front of the smoldering ruins of the depot, Marshal Pike stood before a small gathering of townspeople. He did not wear his badge of office. He stood before them as a man, his face smudged with soot and shame. "I failed you," he said, his voice thick with an emotion no one had ever heard from him before. "I took an oath to uphold the law, and I let my own troubles, my own fear, make me blind to the law being broken right under my nose. I failed Sawyer Hale, and in doing so, I failed this town." He looked directly at Sawyer, who stood at the edge of the small crowd. "I am sorry," he said. It was a simple, unadorned apology, and in its starkness, it was the most profound thing he had ever said. No one spoke. There was no need. The apology was accepted in the quiet dignity of the moment. A collective sigh of relief seemed to pass through Bitter Creek. The poison of suspicion and fear that Sloan had so expertly cultivated was gone, burned away in the night's fire. The change was palpable. as Sawyer walked toward the general store to buy supplies. Men who had averted their eyes from him the day before now met his gaze and nodded. A few even tipped their hats. Mrs. Gable, the seamstress, stopped him on the boardwalk. "Sawyer," she said, a warmth in her voice that had been absent for years. "The church is having a fall fair to raise money for a new roof. We were wondering, would you be willing to provide the beef for the barbecue?" It was more than an invitation. It was an exoneration. It was the community reaching out a hand, welcoming him back from the exile of rumor and misfortune. He looked at the woman's hopeful, expectant face. "I'd be honored, ma'am," he said, the words feeling foreign but good in his mouth. Later that day, the stagecoach brought the mail, and with it, a letter for Eloise Hart. It was from the Territorial Education Board in Carson City. The paper was thick and embossed with an official seal. Her work in bringing education to the territories, it said, had not gone unnoticed. Her courageous stand in Santa Vespera had become something of a quiet legend among the circuit superintendents. They were offering her a position, not as a traveling teacher, but as the headmistress of a new, fully funded school for girls in the capital. The salary they offered was more than she had ever dreamed of. The letter spoke of stability, of a respectable career, of a comfortable house with glass windows and a proper garden. It was everything a sensible person could want, a safe harbor after a lifetime of storms, an end to the wandering. She held the letter in her hand, the heavy paper a tangible representation of a future she had once desperately wanted. She walked, without consciously deciding to, out of town, following the muddy tracks of Sawyer's wagon toward Hollow Draw. She found him by the old barn, the one that had survived, not the one that had burned, but its smaller, sturdier brother. He was working, his back to her, mending a section of the corral fence. He moved with a slow, deliberate economy, every motion honed by years of labor. The late afternoon sun cast his long shadow across the damp earth. He must have heard her footsteps, because he stopped working and turned, but he did not seem surprised to see her. He simply waited, his hands resting on a fence post. She stood before him, the letter from Carson City, a white rectangle in her hand. She didn't know what to say, or why she had come. She felt a profound, aching uncertainty. Sawyer looked from her face to the letter and then back again. He understood. He did not ask what it was. He did not ask her to stay. He did not plead or promise or try to persuade. He simply laid out the truth of two possible futures, as plain and solid as the fence posts between them. "If you go," he said, his voice quiet, matter of fact, "you should leave me a list of the books the children will need. I'll order them from back east." He paused, his gaze steady. "If you stay," he continued, the words coming even more slowly, "we'll build a library, right here, in this old barn." That was all. He presented the choice not as a question of him and her, but as a question of the work that needed to be done. A list of books sent from afar, or a library built together. Eloise looked down at his hands, resting on the rough, weathered wood. They were strong hands, capable. The knuckles on his left hand were a web of old, silvery scars. The back of his right hand was scraped raw from the fight in the gulch and darkened with soot from the fire that had not yet washed away. They were the hands of a man who fought and built and endured. She thought of his coat, of the way she had been wrapped in its scent of smoke and rain, the smell that had once seemed like trouble, but which she now understood to be the smell of a man who would stand between you and the fire. From a nearby pasture, a calf, one of the first of the new season, let out a loud, healthy bleat. The sun, finally free of all clouds, was warm on her back. The water in the horse trough was clear, cleaner than it had been in months, refilled by the storm. Everything felt new, washed clean. She looked at the elegant, official letter in her hand, the promise of a safe and stable life in a city she didn't know. Then she looked at the old barn, at the wide, empty sky over Hollow Draw. and at the man with the burned hands who was offering her not comfort, but purpose. Without a word, she turned the letter over. On the clean, blank space on the back, she used the small pencil attached to her chatelaine to write 2 words. "I'll stay." She folded the letter neatly and tucked it deep into her apron pocket. It was a promise she was making to herself. The next afternoon, she returned. She had borrowed the liveryman's buckboard and loaded the heavy blackboard onto it. She drove the wagon out to Hollow Draw, the wheels cutting fresh ruts in the drying road. When she arrived, the big doors of the old barn were open. Sawyer was waiting for her inside. He had swept the packed earth floor clean. The dusty old stalls had been cleared out, and from the high central beam, he had already hung a long wire, and on it, 3 clean, polished oil lanterns were spaced, ready to be lit. He had been getting the place ready. He had trusted her answer before she had even given it. She stopped the wagon, and he walked out to meet her. They stood on opposite sides of the blackboard, the heavy slate between them. He looked at her, and she looked at him. The silence was not empty. It was filled with everything that had happened between them. The chase, the fire, the church, the rain. It was filled with the future they had just silently agreed to build. They looked at each other long enough to hear the steady, rhythmic heartbeat of the earth beneath their feet. No one needed to say another word. By midday, the old barn at Hollow Draw had become a cathedral of light and shadow. The high sun poured through the gaps in the weathered wallboards, creating solid, geometric shafts of gold that sliced through the dusty air. Within these beams, dust motes danced and swirled, no longer looking like grime, but like a fine, brown gilt, a humble sort of treasure. The space smelled of old hay, clean earth, and the faint, promising scent of freshly sawn pine from the new benches Sawyer was building. Eloise walked into this quiet, sun-drenched space, carrying something over her arm. It was Sawyer's coat. She had taken it back to her small room the night before. After the fire, she had worked on it for hours by lamplight. It was not the same coat. It was clean, the mud and soot washed away with a stiff brush and strong soap. The leather, once stiff with grime, had been treated with saddle oil until it was dark and supple again. The wide, scorched hole in the back, the wound it had taken in the fire, was gone. In its place was a neat, sturdy patch, sewn from a piece of old, oiled canvas from a wagon cover. Her stitches were small and even, a line of disciplined strength closing a wound. She had not tried to hide the repair. The patch was a slightly different color, a testament to the damage it had survived. It was a scar, not a flaw. She held it out to him. "I finished it," she said, her voice soft in the quiet barn. He stopped his work, wiping his hands on his trousers, and took it from her. The coat felt familiar in his hands, but different, lighter, cleaner. He lifted it and brought it closer, inhaling. The old, ingrained scents of horse and worn leather were still there, but the smell of smoke, the ghost that had haunted the garment for a decade, was almost gone. It was just a faint, lingering whisper now, a memory, not a presence, a story that had been told and could now be put to rest. He shrugged it on. The fit was the same, the familiar weight settling on his shoulders like an old friend. He flexed his arms, the patched section pulling taut across his back. It held strong. He stood there for a moment, wearing the armor he had worn his entire adult life, the shield he had used to keep the world at bay. Then, slowly, he took it off. He held it in his hands for a second, looking at it not as a piece of clothing, but as a part of himself he was now ready to set aside. He let his fingers uncurl. He let it drop. It fell to the clean-swept, packed earth floor. It did not land with the heavy, final thud of their tense encounter in the church. This time, it landed with a soft, settled sigh. A deliberate release, a conscious act of laying down a burden, of choosing to stand undefended in the warm, sunlit air of his own home. Eloise watched it fall, her expression unreadable but for the softness in her eyes. A slow smile touched her lips. "You still smell like trouble," she said. The words a gentle echo of their first meeting, but imbued with a new, profound meaning. The right kind, though. The kind I'd choose to wake up to every morning. Sawyer looked from the coat on the floor to her face, and the last of the shadows in his stormy eyes seemed to recede. "If I'm trouble," he answered, his voice a low, rough murmur, "then it's the kind of trouble that knows how to sew the alphabet on a blackboard and save the books from a fire." It was an acknowledgement of all she was, all she had done. He saw her not as a woman to be protected, but as an equal, a partner whose strength matched his own. He took a step forward, closing the small space between them. He gently cupped her face in his hands, his calloused, soot-stained thumbs stroking her cheeks. He lowered his head and kissed her. It was not a kiss of passion or desperation. It was short and light, and as honest as the sun streaming through the walls. It held no demands and no grand promises. It was a kiss of quiet understanding, a simple, unspoken agreement to share the work ahead, a seal on a partnership. When they parted, the world outside the barn continued its steady, peaceful rhythm. From the pasture, the low, contented sound of the herd could be heard, a rumbling counterpoint to the quiet of the barn. The wind, now a gentle breeze, whispered through the eaves, carrying the clean, sweet scent of new grass growing on rain-soaked earth. On the newly whitewashed wall of the barn, a simple, hand-painted sign Sawyer had finished that morning swayed slightly in the breeze, in neat, black letters. It read, "The Hollow Draw Library." Below it, on the floor, the discarded coat lay, its work done, as still and faithful as an old dog sleeping in the sun. As they stood there in the comfortable silence, a new sound intruded, the slow, steady clop of a single horse and the rattle of a wagon. They turned to see Marshal Pike pulling his buckboard to a halt in front of the open barn doors. He didn't get down. He simply sat there for a moment, looking at the two of them, and at the new sign on the wall. A slow, small smile touched his lips. In the back of his wagon was a large wooden crate. He gestured toward it with his chin. "Town donation," he said, his voice gruff but kind. "Folks heard what you were building. Figured you could use a start." He didn't wait for a thank you. He gave them a single, profound nod, a gesture of respect, of apology, of a new beginning for all of them. Then he clicked the reins, and the wagon rattled away, leaving the crate of books sitting in the yard. A tangible offering from a town that was ready to heal. In the distance, from the town they could not see, a sound drifted on the clear air. The church bell, ringing the noon hour, a single, clear chime for each hour, marking the steady, reliable passage of time. Sawyer looked at Eloise. Eloise looked at Sawyer, and then their eyes fell upon the coat, lying on the floor between them. As one, without a word spoken, they both bent down. Their hands met over the soft, worn leather, and together they lifted it, and the new day, from the ground. Thank you for listening to this story. I'd love to know where in the world you're tuning in from, so please leave a comment below and share your thoughts. If you enjoyed this tale, please consider subscribing to the channel. Wild West Stories 1850, and give this video a like. Your support, especially by hitting the hype button, helps these stories reach more listeners just like you.